online lessons. And in today's lesson, you need to have your Term 3 revision booklet on you. If you don't have it, I'm going to share my screen later on, but we're going to be working through that. And it's going to be quite a lot of work that we're going to be covering, because we're going to be doing the nervous system, the eye, the ear, the endocrine system, a bit of homeostasis, plant hormones, and hopefully a little bit on human impact on the environment. So it is quite a lot that we're going to be covering. So I'm first going to share my screen with you again, and then we're going to be we're going to be using the learner resource. Okay, so the one that we were working with the last time was this one. And I don't know if you remember, but I had a few minutes left and I just started doing this section on the nervous system. So we went as far as the end of the brain. So today I'm just going to go over the spinal cord and quickly go over the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system once again. So I just want to show you this little picture once again. So we did look at this last week. So over here, you can see that the central nervous system is divided into the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord over here. And then you've got your peripheral nervous system, which will be your 12 pairs of cranial nerves and your 31 pairs of spinal nerves. All right. And then this little diagram also just quickly shows you how the nervous system is subdivided. So on the left over here, we've got the central nervous system, which has been drawn in blue. So that is the brain and the spinal cord. And in last time's lesson, I did quickly go over the functions of the different parts of the brain. And that's obviously what you need to study for the exams. And then the peripheral nervous system is shown over here on the right-hand side in this diagram. So those would be your cranial nerves and your spinal nerves. And then it gets a little bit more complicated, because then you can see your peripheral nervous system is divided into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system, I did touch on this last week. So basically you can think of autonomic and automatic. So all the things that happen that you don't have much control of, right? So they are involuntary reactions, and you can see that the autonomic nervous system is again subdivided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And an easy way of remembering the difference between the two is, imagine that you get a huge fright, or imagine if you're very, very nervous when you have to say an oral in front of the whole class, or in my case, maybe even present a lesson online to a whole lot of pupils. So in the beginning, your heart starts beating a little bit more quickly and your pupils dilate and so on. So those are all the types of reactions that are brought about by the sympathetic nervous system. And then obviously you would completely burn out if this happened all the time. So your parasympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that then brings the body back to normal again. All right. And then your somatic nervous system is divided into the sensory part and the motor part. And I'm going to show you that just now when we look at the cross section through the spinal cord again. So the diagram that we are going to be looking at next is, I want you to have a look at the spinal cord over here. And now imagine that we're going to cut the spinal cord in half over here. So we're going to do a cross section through the spinal cord. And that's what we're going to be looking at next, going back to your notes in your learner resource. So that will be this one over here. Okay. Now this diagram, I must say, I have often seen in the exams, so I really recommend that you really study this very well. So this is now the cross section of the spinal cord over here, and you'll see that it's a little bit different in the brain, because in the brain we have the gray matter on the outside and the white matter on the inside, and it's just the opposite in the spinal cord. So your gray matter is almost in the shape of an H on the inside, and then the white matter is on the outside. And the gray matter is gray in color because a lot of the cell bodies of the neurons are situated there, and the white matter is white in color because of the myelin sheaths that surround your axons that are often situated in this area. Then I want you to notice that there is a spinal nerve that enters the spinal cord actually on each side. So in this diagram, it looks as if it's only entering on the one side, but there is a spinal nerve on the other side as well. And then that spinal nerve forms the dorsal root over here at the top and the ventral root over here at the bottom. And you can also see that inside the dorsal root, there is a neuron. So this is a sensory neuron over here. There's a little swelling, and this is where the cell body of the sensory neuron is situated. And then inside the gray matter, you've got an interneuron. And then over here, this is a motor neuron over here. Now, I want you to look at that carefully because just now we're going to be doing the structure of the neuron, and then we're going to talk about these three types once again. So once again, this one that goes in at the dorsal root is the sensory neuron. This one over here is the interneuron, and this one over here is the motor neuron. So I do suggest that you study this very carefully. So obviously, the spinal cord allows impulses to travel from every single part of the body to the brain and obviously back again. And then the spinal cord is also responsible for reflex actions. And we're going to talk about these reflex actions in a minute. Okay, so I've spoken about the spinal nerves, the dorsal and ventral roots, and where the sensory and motor neurons are situated. And I've spoken about the functions of the spinal cord. And I've briefly mentioned the peripheral nervous system and that it's divided into the somatic nervous system over here and the autonomic nervous system over here. And then we've said that the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic nervous system, the one that prepares the body for an emergency, and it's divided into the parasympathetic system, which returns the body back to normal again. So we've spoken about that briefly. And here they just show you once again some things that happen in the body. For example, when your body has to be prepared for an emergency. So your heart rate increases, your pupils dilate, your blood pressure increases, and there are lots of other things that happen as well. So for example, there's more blood which flows to your muscles of your body and even to your heart, and less to your digestive system. And then as you can see, these are then some of the activities that happen that restore the body back to normal again. Okay, then the other thing that you do need to know is how to draw a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. And now a lot of textbooks have many, many labels included. And I want you to again look at your examination guidelines so that you know exactly what labels you actually need to know. All right, so let's just have a look at one of these sensory neurons once again. So over here, there are three main parts. So this little bit over here is the cell body over here. And the cell body has got a nucleus, it's got cytoplasm, it's got a cell membrane on the outside, it's got little Nissl granules, and these Nissl granules play a role that produce certain proteins. And then you've got, so that's the one part of a neuron, the cell body. And then you've got two types of nerve fibers. So you've got these nerve fibers over here, which are called dendrites. And dendrites always conduct impulses towards the cell body. So here it's been highlighted. So dendrites conduct impulses towards the cell body. Then this motor neuron over here has got a single axon, and there at the end it branches a little bit, and the axon always conducts impulses away from the cell body. And the axon, you can see, is also surrounded by a fatty material, which is called myelin, and this myelin sheath is produced by the Schwann cells, which surround the axon over here. Now, you could also obviously be asked to draw a sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron looks slightly different. So this is an example of a sensory neuron, but now they haven't included all the labels. They've just put the cell body over here. But over here, this would be the dendrite over here because it's going towards the cell body. And this over here is the axon, which transmits impulses away from the cell body. I just want to show you quickly how important it is to look at your examination guidelines. So I'm quickly going to refer to that. So, for example, these are now the examination guidelines, which really give you a very good indication of exactly what to study. So over here it says you need to know the functions of sensory and motor neurons. Then it also says you need to do the structure and functions of parts of sensory and motor neurons using diagrams. And there it tells you these are the labels that you must include: nucleus, cell body, cytoplasm, myelin sheath, axon, and dendrites. Okay, so you will see some textbooks talk about Schwann cells and neurilemma and denisol granules and so on. But according to the examination guidelines, those are the labels that you need to know. So that is why it's very important to always refer to these. All right. So now we're going to go back to our resource again. So there we go. We were busy over here with the neuron. So please remember, you must be able to draw a sensory and a motor neuron, and you must know the differences between 3 different neurons. And I'm just going to go back to that. So sensory neurons, they always transmit impulses from the receptors over here to the spinal cord. So from the receptors to the spinal cord. And when we do the reflex arc just now, I'm going to show you what the receptors and the effectors are. Then motor neurons, they always transmit impulses from the spinal cord to the effector organs. And the effector organs are muscles or glands. So muscles which can obviously contract, and glands which will then secrete certain substances, maybe hormones. And then your interneurons, these are just found between the sensory and the motor neurons. So please, you do need to know about those 3 types of neurons. Now let us quickly look at the reflex arc and a reflex action. All right, so over here, this diagram, which I also want you to study carefully, this is a diagram of a reflex arc. Now, a reflex arc simply shows you the pathway that the nerve impulse travels. All right, so over here, the pathway is always from the receptor over here, and then it goes, maybe let me just do this quickly. So it goes from the receptor, and this is the sensory neuron that I'm highlighting. So it's going over here, there's the sensory neuron, then it goes through the dorsal root, remember? And then it goes there, it's joining up with the spinal cord over here. So that is the sensory neuron. And remember, I told you just now, the sensory neuron conducts impulses from the receptor to the spinal cord. Now, a receptor, you get different types of receptors in the body. So in this case, you can see that there's a little candle flame over here. So this would obviously be a thermoreceptor. So a receptor which is sensitive to heat or cold. But you get pain receptors in your skin. You get mechanoreceptors, for example, in your ears that are sensitive to sound waves. You've got chemoreceptors in your tongue and in your nose, which are sensitive to chemicals. So you get different types of receptors. So a receptor basically receives a stimulus from the environment. And that stimulus could be light, it could be sound, it could be pressure or pain or heat or cold, right? So that in this case, this would be a thermoreceptor. Right, now then now we're explaining the reflex arc. So now it goes to the interneuron, and there's your interneuron over there. So it is between your sensory neuron and your motor neuron. And then the impulse is going to travel to the motor neuron. So this is the motor neuron over here, and it travels through the ventral root, and then it goes over here to an effector. And this little picture is of a little muscle, because obviously it could go to a gland as well, because effectors could be muscles or glands. But in this case, if you've put your finger over a hot flame, then obviously the muscles in your hand need to contract so that you can quickly remove your hand or your finger from that stimulus, which in this case is heat. So the pathway along which this nerve impulse travels, that we call the reflex arc. A reflex action is simply a quick or rapid response which happens automatically without the brain being involved, and it is there to protect the body from harm or from injury. Right? So if somebody throws something at you, you need to quickly duck your head or move your head to one side. Or if you stand on a sharp thorn, you're obviously quickly going to move your foot. So a reflex action is a quick or rapid response and it happens automatically without the brain being involved, and it is to protect the body or to prevent the body from being harmed or injured. All right? So over here you can see there are the definitions of the, I want to delete this. Oh, wait. Okay, there are the definitions of the reflex action. So it's a quick automatic response to a stimulus and does not involve the brain, e.g. blinking of eyes, coughing, etc. And there's the reflex arc, the pathway in which nerve impulses are conducted from a receptor to an effector to bring about a reflex action. This I would also suggest that you study very well, because I've seen this question a lot in exams. Right, there it nicely is illustrated in your learner resource. That is the pathway. So it's always from the receptor along a sensory neuron, then it joins up, then the impulse goes to an interneuron, then to a motor neuron, and then to an effector. Right, then between your neurons over here, you can see they aren't connected directly. There isn't direct contact between, for example, that sensory neuron and this interneuron. But somehow or other, the message or the impulse has to travel across that little gap. And that area is called the synapse. So it is the area where there is close contact between let's say the dendrites, or let's make it in this case the axon of one neuron and the dendrites of the next neuron. So you do need to know about the synapse as well. All right. And then diseases of the central nervous system. I'm just going to quickly show you a picture of these two diseases. So over here, you can see, okay, first the Alzheimer's disease. So this is actually quite sad if people get Alzheimer's, because maybe grandparents or your grandfather or grandmother might even have Alzheimer's, because it normally happens in older people. And really, if you compare the normal brain over here to somebody that has got Alzheimer's, you will see that there literally is a shrinkage of the brain, and the person suffers from memory loss, and they can't remember the names of people. And to be honest, when it's really sad later on, they can't even recognize their own children. All right. So this causes, so obviously you wouldn't be able to drive, and sometimes if you go for walks, you can't remember where your house is anymore. So it's quite a sad so it's literally the neurons in the brain are not functioning optimally anymore. And then multiple sclerosis you also need to know about. Now here you can see This is an axon or nerve fiber surrounded by a myelin sheath, and this is very healthy. But with multiple sclerosis, which they also call MS, which basically anybody can get, and it's really an autoimmune disease because your own immune system starts attacking this myelin sheath which surrounds the nerve fibers. And here you can see the myelin sheath has got thinner and thinner, and it obviously causes a lot. It has many effects on the body. So in the beginning, it might just be a tingling sensation in the muscles and so on. But later on, it can really cause things like blindness, and obviously the person can land up in a wheelchair because they cannot move their certain muscles. So this is also quite a serious disease, and it is an autoimmune disease. Right, so that is the section on the nervous system, and I think we're just going to do one or two questions on this before I go on to the eye and the ear. So I'm going to, many of you have got Mind the Gap, so I'm going to quickly go to Mind the Gap quickly. And in Mind the Gap, let me just scroll down quickly. So we've done all of this, the reflex arc. Here is an activity over here. I think we're going to do this one together. Let's see if you all know this. So it says, use the diagram of the reflex arc. Now you can look at the reflex arc in your notes. It is on page 9 on your notes. All right, so have a look on page 9. There's a picture of the reflex arc, and otherwise we're just going to have to scroll up. Now this is a multiple choice question, so this is what these are the type of questions you're going to get in your paper as well. And I've told you right in the very first lesson, when you answer a question like this, you only need to write down an A, B, C, or D. That's all you need to do. So it says part B indicates now let's look at the picture quickly. So there we go. This, I think that they're talking to let me just see if this is the question that they're talking about on page 44. Yes. So part B is this bit over here. So what does it indicate over there? Remember I showed it you just now. So is it the dendrites of the motor neuron? Is it the axon of the motor neuron? Is it the dendrite of the sensory neuron, or the axon of the sensory neuron? Now we know that this is a sensory neuron over here, and over here, remember, there's the cell body over there. So remember, what did we say? The part that conducts the impulse towards the cell body, is it a dendrite or an axon? Think about that quickly. Right, I hope you all got that right. So that would be the dendrite, right? Because the axon is this part which conducts impulse away from the cell body. So the answer over there would be the dendrite of the sensory neuron, but you don't write that down, you write down C. Okay? Then the next question says, the correct sequence in which impulses move from the receptor to the effector in the reflex arc is... Now we've got all these different options. Now there's the receptor over here. So obviously it's first going to go along B, then it's going to go along, well, first it's actually going to start with A. So I don't know if that was an option, but it's going to go from the receptor A, B, C, D, and E, right? That's the part. So receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, and effector. And that's probably going to be one of our options, A, B, C, D, E. So that's that. So we write down A. Then it says, give the correct term for the following definitions. Now, actually, I'm going to give you a minute or two to quickly do that, and you can do that together with the person sitting next to you. So quickly do that, and then we'll see if you got the right answers. I'll give you just a minute or two to do that. Okay, let us see if you got all of those right, and I sincerely hope you did. So the first answer is receptor, the next one effector, motor, and you can also call it an efferent neuron, that is correct. Sensory or afferent neuron, the next one is an interneuron, then reflex action, and then reflex arc. So I hope you got all of those correct. If you did, that's fantastic. And now we're going to quickly do, as I said, before I go on to the eye and the ear, we're going to do an example from your notes. And we are going to, I must just have a look what I wrote down over here. Okay, we're going to do number 2 on page 26. So in your learner resource, just turn to page 26 quickly. And then we're going to do number 2. Now, there's some questions that are printed in dark, in bold, and those are the more difficult ones. So this is the question that I want you to do. So we're on page 26. Okay, there we go. Right, it's again on a reflex arc. Now this is slightly different. So here you can see this little bit over here is the receptor, and that little bit is the effector, right? And remember, this over here is your dorsal root, and there's your ventral root. So this question is again on a reflex arc, and I'm now going to give you a few minutes to do the questions. So they say, what is a reflex action? Label the functional connection at D and the neuron name B. Now, all of you must get that correct. State one significance. Actually, let's leave out question 3. Let's leave that out. Then this next one, question 4, you can do. Because that's not, even though it's in bold, you should all be able to do that. Write down in the correct order the letters of the neurons involved from the time a stimulus is received until a response takes place. You'll definitely be able to do that. We're going to leave out 3. We're going to do number 4. And then this one also, I want you to think about that carefully. Explain the consequences for a reflex action if neuron C is damaged. Now let's look at this picture. So there's there's the first neuron, A, all right, which is taking impulses from the receptor to the central nervous system. And now imagine that this motor neuron over here, the one that's going to the muscle, now imagine that gets injured in an accident or something. Now I want you to imagine what the effect of that would be on the body, right? I'm sure you're going to get that one right as well. And then we're going to leave out number 6. So leave out number 3 and 6, and I want you to do the others. You can quickly do that in pairs, and we'll see if you got that answer correct as well. I'll give you also a few minutes to do that question. Okay, maybe you've just had time to chat about it and not write all of this down, but let's quickly see how you did. So the first question is, what is a reflex action? Now remember, a reflex arc and a reflex action are different. So a reflex action will be a rapid response to a stimulus. So it's a rapid automatic response to a stimulus without the brain being involved, and it obviously is to protect the body against injury. Then label the functional connection at D. So that I told you is called a synapse. Then label neuron B, that is your interneuron. Then I said leave out number 3. Then I said write out, then you need to do the correct order, but letters only, of the neurons involved from the time a stimulus is received until a response takes place. So the correct order is going to be A, then B, and then C. All right? So that's the right answer, A, B, and C. Then it says, explain the consequences for a reflex action if neuron C is damaged, all right? So this is the motor neuron. Now remember, the motor neuron conducts impulses to a muscle, and muscles, you know, will contract if they get a stimulus. So if C is damaged, obviously the stimulus will still go from, the impulse will still go from the receptor to the central nervous system, but because the motor neuron is damaged, the muscles will no longer be able to contract. So the person will not be able to respond to the stimulus, all right? So they will be able to receive the stimulus, but they will not be able to respond to the stimulus. That muscle will not be able to contract. Okay, now we are going to go back to where we were, so you can go back in your notes again, and we're going to carry on with the eye and the ear. And the eye is on page 11. So we're going to go back to page 11 quickly. There we go. And I'm going to actually, I see the diagrams in Mind the Gap are very similar. So I'm actually going to use Mind the Gap. Okay, so there we go. So the first thing is, this is a fantastic diagram, and it's got all the parts of the eye and the functions. So really, I really recommend that you study this very, very well. Okay, let's just go over this very, very quickly. So firstly, over here at the front, you've got, okay, you firstly got the conjunctiva over here. That's this membrane over here, which is for protection. Then you've got this transparent cornea, all right? You can see it bulges out slightly, and the cornea is transparent to obviously allow light to pass through. And then secondly, it refracts the light rays. So refraction means that the light rays, instead of traveling straight through, are going to be bent slightly. And this is important because your light rays need to be focused on this part over here. All right, this is the yellow spot. So we want the light rays to fall on the retina of the eye, but particular on the yellow spot, because otherwise you're going to see a very blurred image. Now the cornea plays a role in bending or refracting the light rays. Okay, then if we carry on, this part over here is the white part of the eye, and it is called the sclera, and it's where your eye muscles are attached, so that allows you to look in different directions. And it also is it's a very, very tough membrane, and it protects the eye. I know we often do a dissection of the eye of a cow with our matrix, and to be honest, it's really difficult to actually get your scalpel through the sclera because it is a very tough membrane, okay? So it's a tough outer coat which protects the eye from damage. Okay, then over here at the back, we've got the optic nerve, and the optic nerve will carry impulses to the optic lobe of the brain. And you know, your eye is just a tool which helps you to see, but the brain really does all the interpretation of what you see. So this optic nerve carries impulses towards the optic lobe of the brain. Now we go on to this middle layer, And the middle layer, the front little bit that hangs down over here, is the iris. And the iris can be different colors. So some people have blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes or whatever. So it contains pigments, but the iris also has very important muscles in it called circular and radial muscles. And these muscles, when they contract and relax, control the size of the pupil. The pupil is this little gap over here, and it's often dark in color, and this allows light to pass through to the retina. But now your iris, with those muscles inside it, controls the size of the pupil. So if you look into bright light, if it's very sunny outside and you look into bright light, obviously this pupil needs to constrict. It needs to get smaller, otherwise it's going to damage the retina. And then at night, when the light is very dim, the pupil needs to dilate or get bigger so that more light is able to enter the eye. So that's the iris. Then you've got over here the ciliary body, and the ciliary body contains a muscle called the ciliary muscle. And this muscle we're going to talk about later because it plays a very important role in something which we call accommodation. And accommodation is when the lens over here changes shape in order to see objects at different distances. And we're going to talk about accommodation a little bit later. So that's the ciliary body, and that's the ciliary muscle. And you can see the little lines over here. These are little suspensory ligaments which hold the lens in place over here. Then this part over here is called the choroid, and the choroid contains dark pigment which absorbs light rays and prevents them from being reflected inside the eye. And then it also contains lots of blood vessels which provide nutrients to your photoreceptors and so on. And then we've got this inner layer, which is the retina, which is very, very important. So it contains your photoreceptors, your rods and your cones, and these allow you to see in bright light, in dim light, and also to see different colors. There is your yellow spot, which has a very high concentration of cones. So this is where the sharpest image is. And then you've got the blind spot, where if your light rays all converge on the blind spot, there's actually if the image actually falls there, you won't actually be able to see it. All right, because there are no rods and cones there. And then this whole area is filled with a jelly-like material, which is called the vitreous humor. And also, when I do that dissection with my matrix, once that jelly-like, which is completely clear, once it comes out of the eye, the whole eye sort of collapses. So it really, as I said, helps with providing shape to the eyeball. And then there's like a liquid in the front, which is called the aqueous humor. And then, of course, your lens, which is like, it's also completely transparent, and it's made up of a very firm jelly-like material, and it can change shape, which allows your light rays to be focused on the yellow spot over here. And this is obviously important to see things at different distances. So this diagram with the labels is fantastic. It's got all the information that you need. Right. Then, as I said, there are two things, and the matrics often get confused between these two processes. And the one is called accommodation, and the other is called the pupillary reflex. And to be honest, these questions are often asked in the exams. So again, I would spend some time focusing on these two. Now, accommodation, really, it says over here, this is the definition, it is the adjustment of the shape of the lens to see objects clearly, whether they are far away or close by. All right, so it really has to it has to do with the changing of the shape of the lens. Here you can see, if you look at this diagram on the left and the one on the right, the lens has got a different shape. Here it's sort of thin and flat, and here it's round and fat. It's round and fat and swollen, right? So it's got to do with the shape of the lens that changes. But now, why does this have to happen? Well, as I said, it is to see objects at different distances. So while you're looking at the screen now in order to follow this whole lesson, you looking, it will probably be more than 6 meters away. So this is what the eye will look like. So now what happens? So this is to see objects that are further than 6 meters away. And you can see your ciliary muscle, which is over here, is relaxed. Now, this is another thing that pupils often get confused with. They don't, it happens to be a circular muscle, it is circular in shape, but you must call it a ciliary muscle and not a circular muscle, right? So don't get confused. So your ciliary muscle over here is relaxed, and that sort of pulls, so these suspensory ligaments over here are pulled tight and they pull on the lens, and the lens is much flatter, it is less convex. Then to see things close up, so if you want to look down at your notes again, then the shape of the lens has to change, because the light rays now need to be they need to be refracted much more, so that, as I said, the light rays fall on the yellow spot over here on the retina. So when you look at objects close to you, then your ciliary muscle is going to contract, and the suspensory ligaments, you can see they're not pulled tight anymore, they slacken, and the lens becomes much more rounded. We say it becomes more convex, and your light rays are now going to be refracted much more so that they can be focused on the retina. Okay, so you do need to know exactly, you must be able to describe accommodation step by step, exactly like this, for when you're looking at things further than 6 meters away, and then also when you're looking at things close up, less than 6 meters away. Now, how does that compare to the pupillary mechanism? Now, the pupillary mechanism, you can just remember pupil of eye. The pupil of the eye is that black part at the center of the eye. So the pupillary mechanism, there's the definition. This regulates the amount of light entering the eye by adjusting the size of the pupil. Okay, and you should also be able to explain this step by step. Now let's just look at this little picture. There we've got the pupil, the black part in the middle. Now around that, you've got your iris, which is the colored part of the eye. But in the iris, you've got circular muscles, the ones that are going around and around like that. And then you've got radial muscles. They almost look like the spokes of a wheel, right? Those are the radial muscles. Now, if you look at something that's very bright, then your pupil obviously has to get much smaller, okay? So how does that happen? These circular muscles over here are going to contract. The radial muscles will relax, because these muscles work antagonistically to each other. They have opposite effects. And this pupil is going to get smaller and less light enters the eye. Right? That's not very difficult, is it? And then when you obviously at night, the pupil has to get much larger. We say it needs to dilate and more light needs to come in. So just the opposite happens now. So now your radial muscles contract, the ones that are like the spokes of a wheel, and the circular muscles relax, and the pupil dilates or gets bigger, and more light flows in. So here you can see, here we've spoken about circular muscles, and in the previous one, we spoke about ciliary muscles. So don't get those two mixed up, all right? Pupillary mechanism has to do with the pupil, all right? The accommodation has to do with that lens that changes shape. Right. Then we need to just know about some visual defects. Okay, now I'm sure quite some of you are probably wearing glasses, or some of you maybe are wearing contact lenses. So some people, they are some people are short-sighted, right? So that means that they everything that is close by, like the page in front of them, they can see that clearly. But for example, if they have to look at the person writing on the blackboard or on the screen, then they cannot see those letters, all right? So they cannot see things that are far away. Now, this is often genetic, and you can see there are different causes of this. Sometimes you can see that the eyeball is actually much longer than normal. So you can see what's happening over here. Your light rays are entering the cornea and the lens, but instead of being or converging, now they're being refracted, which is what's supposed to happen, but now instead of being refracted on the retina, like over here, they're all converging in front of the retina. So that person is going to see a very blurred image, right? That's only one of the factors that could be responsible for short-sightedness, all right? Because we want those light rays have to be refracted by the cornea and the lens, but then they should all converge on the retina over here. And then obviously, because of technology, which is just so amazing, people can have glasses made at an optometrist, and then the glasses that are made have got concave lenses like this. So you rectify the problem by wearing concave lenses, and they will then refract the light rays in such a way that they all come together over here on the retina. Okay, then long-sightedness is obviously just the opposite. And very often people that are older, they are able to see things in the distance, but they can no longer read their books and so on, and they need to wear glasses. So long-sightedness, again, is there many, these are all different causes of long-sightedness, or what happens basically. But yeah, you can see in the little diagram, sometimes the eyeball is shorter than normal, and again, instead of the light rays all converging on the retina over here, they actually fall behind the retina. Again, because of this amazing technology, this can be rectified by wearing lenses that are convex, so that there is that the light rays are refracted correctly. And then you get, there isn't a picture of this. Oh, here it is, astigmatism. So this is uneven curvature of the lens or cornea. And again, this can be rectified wearing glasses with lenses that are shaped correctly. And then you also sometimes get something called cataracts. You sometimes see this in animals as well when they start getting older. If you look into their eyes, it looks a little bit gray and cloudy. So the lens becomes cloudy and opaque. And again, older people, if this happens, they can have surgery, and this is amazing. So the actual lens is replaced with a synthetic lens, and the people have good eyesight again. Okay, I'm going to, because I've been speaking quite a lot, I'm going to let you do this activity 3, which is in Mind the Gap, quickly. And you may again do this in pairs or in groups. So this is the first one. Yeah, you just need to label a few things. Then it says, name and describe the process that causes part 1 to dilate, to become wider, that little bit. And then this is also quite a nice diagram. You're going to have to work quite quickly. It says, Figure 6.14 is a longitudinal section through a human eye. The structures which enable the eye to focus on objects are missing. So in other words, they haven't drawn the lens, they haven't drawn the ciliary body and the ciliary muscle, they haven't drawn the suspensory ligaments. Then it says, draw a longitudinal section through the missing parts of this figure to indicate the appearance of these structures when you are A, reading a book, and B, looking at an object more than 6 meters away. Now, we're not going to have time to do both of these. So I want you to very quickly do question 1, all of that, and then do question 2A. And then I'll see how you've done. Okay, I'll give you a few minutes to do this on the eye. I think, let me scroll it down, then you should all be able to see that. Okay, I'm going to quickly go over the answers and see how you did. Hopefully you got all these correct. So the answer for 2 is cornea, 3 lens, 4 suspensory ligaments, and 5 ciliary muscles or ciliary body. Then the next question was name and describe the process. Now remember, name just, there it is, just gives the name for. Describe, because it's 5 marks, you are going to describe a whole process. So you're going to write a little paragraph about what happens. This describe is important. So always look at the mark allocation and look how they word the question. So over here, so it's called the pupillary mechanism, and the radial muscles of the iris contract, the circular muscles relax, the pupil dilates, and more light enters the eye. I hope you all got that right. Then the next one is draw a longitudinal section through the missing parts of this to show what it looks like when reading a book. So reading a book, remember that lens has to be very convex so that the light rays are refracted more. Now, when you do a diagram, remember, always do it in pencil, and then also do all your labels and label lines in pen, and also give a heading to your diagram. Okay, so I said you didn't have to do both. So there you can see they've obviously simplified the diagram a bit. Now, some of you have maybe drawn the rest of the the rest of the eye as well. That isn't correct, but that isn't wrong at all. That's fine, but you do need to show this clearly. So there you can see that your ciliary muscle, they've got the right label, has contracted. There you can see your suspensory ligaments, and you can see it in the diagram. They are not taut like over here. They are slackened. And then your lens is nice and round and convex. Okay, so I hope you got that right as well. This is what it would look like if you had to compare the two when you're looking at something that is further than 6 meters away. Right. Now we're going to go on to the ear. So in your notes, you can actually turn to page 14. Okay, I have got Mind the Gap open, and the diagrams are very similar. So I'm just going to carry on with this. So firstly, the ear is divided into the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear, right? So the outer ear, I'm sure you know these labels. There's your ear pinna. There's your external auditory canal. This is your eardrum, but because we're now doing matric biology, we're going to call it the tympanic membrane, right? So there's the tympanic membrane again. There are your 3 little bony ossicles, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. There's your, oh, I always get confused with this, but I think this is the round window. I'll check just now. I get mixed up, which I should know by now. And that's a little membrane. And there's the oval window. I'll just check that I haven't got those two wrong. Then over here, you've got your 3 semicircular canals over here. And this little bit that looks like the shell of a snail is the cochlea, and that bit is the auditory nerve, right? And the ear, this is something that people often forget, is not only concerned with hearing, it's also concerned with balance, all right? So this part of the ear is concerned with hearing, and that whole bit over here is concerned, sorry, let me just get my mouse working properly. So that's concerned with balance, okay? There we've got a more detailed diagram, okay? Now this is quite nice, and this is exactly the same as the one that you've got because it shows you what all the functions are of the ear. So your ear pinna directs sound waves to the eardrum over here. Your ear canal or auditory canal transmits sound waves to the eardrum or the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane transmits sound waves to the middle ear, and there you've got your 3 bony ossicles. What do? They transmit vibrations from the eardrum to the inner ear. And then we didn't mention that the eustachian tube is also important because this leads to the back of your throat. And this allows air to enter because this whole middle ear is filled with air, right? And it allows air to enter, and it makes sure that the air pressure on the either side of this tympanic membrane is the same, right? So that it equalizes the pressure on either side of it. If the pressure is not equalized, it does distort one's hearing. Right, there are your semicircular canals, which are involved in balance. And yeah, you've got these difficult words to remember. So that's the sacculus and utriculus, right? They're also concerned with balance. Then you've got your auditory nerve, which we've spoken about, the cochlea, which is involved in hearing. And inside the cochlea, you've got something called the organ of Corti, right? You do need to know that word, which converts sound waves into nerve impulses. So these also have got, it's a type of receptor, okay? And then let's see, so the oval window is the one at the top. It transmits sound waves to the inner ear, and the round window releases pressure from the inner ear. So just remember that this part is filled with air, but these parts, the semicircular canals and the cochlea, they are all filled with liquids, all right? Now the process of hearing, Okay, so there they show by means of arrows the direction that the sound waves go. So they get picked up by the ear punner, travel down the auditory canal. That causes the eardrum to vibrate. That in turn causes vibrations of the three bony ossicles. That then causes the membrane of this oval window to vibrate. And now remember, from there, it's going into liquids. So that is going to cause the liquids of the that are found inside the cochlea to start. You get these sort of pressure waves inside the cochlea, and that in turn is going to stimulate that little organ of Corti, which is found in the cochlea, and that stimulus is converted to a nerve impulse, and that nerve impulse is carried by means of the auditory nerve to the cerebrum of the brain, right? The cerebrum of the brain is involved in hearing, right? And it will interpret whatever you're hearing. So this is the pathway, and I've actually very briefly described what each part of the ear does as well. Okay, so there we've said what the ossicles do, and we've spoken about the organ of Corti, and so on, and we've spoken about the auditory nerve as well. Now, what about balance? Now, I told you that the organs of balance are found over here in the semicircular canals. There's a little swelling at the bottom over here, and inside that swelling, you've got there are little structures called cristae, right? And inside this sacculus and utriculus, there are little receptors called the cristae and the maculae. Now, I know these are difficult words to remember, but in some textbooks, there are even more structures that they speak about. But to be honest, you only need to know what the role is of the cristae and the maculae with regards to balance, all right? So the cristae are found over here in these little swellings at the ends of the semicircular canals, and the maculae are found over here in the sacculus and utriculus over here, and they both help you to keep your balance. So you can imagine when you've been on a merry-go-round and you get off that merry-go-round and you're feeling all dizzy, all right? That's where your little receptors, your cristae and maculae, are involved in that. All right. And even as you're sitting on your chair right now, you also are having to balance on that chair and you're not supposed to topple over. So again, there are various muscles in your body involved, but also these little cristae and maculae. Okay, so here it says what they do. So the cristae in the semicircular canals, remember I told you in the swelling, they stimulated by changes in the direction and speed of movement. Okay, and then the maculae in the sacculus and utriculus are stimulated by changes in the position of the head. So whether your head's on its side, like when you're sleeping, or whether it's upright, like how you've got your head positioned now. And then both of these, right, when they're stimulated, and they're now going to be stimulated by those fluids that we find inside the semicircular canal and inside the sacculus and cristae. So when they are stimulated, these cristae and maculae convert the stimulus into a nerve impulse, and the nerve impulse then transports it carries these impulses via the auditory nerve to the cerebellum. Now remember, I said with hearing, the nerve impulse goes to the cerebrum. But remember right in the beginning when we did the structure of the brain, and this is really important, now the nerve impulse is sent to the cerebellum, because remember, your cerebellum is involved in balance and coordination, right? So it is going to work together with these, with the cristae and maculae to keep your balance. Okay, then you need to know something about hearing defects. All right, so sometimes if you've got a really bad cold, for example, then there's a lot of mucus that builds up in that eustachian tube, right? And it can also cause some of those bacteria to go into that middle ear cavity, and it's going to affect hearing and so on. Now, if you get constant ear infections, they can implant something called a grommet through the eardrum, and that grommet simply drains all those fluids out of the ear. Obviously, you can also take antibiotics because antibiotics are a type of medication which will fight off bacterial infections. And then obviously you could also become deaf because of an injury to a part of the ear. So there could be an injury to maybe, okay, there they say as well, those little ossicles, they could become hard and so on. So in other words, they're not transmitting those vibrations to that oval window anymore. It could be hardened earwax, but it could also be an injury to a part of the ear, maybe something in the inner ear, something in the organ of Corti, which is involved in hearing, or it could be the nerves which conduct impulses to the brain. So it could be any of those. And very often in older people, their hearing tends to suffer. Unfortunately, they can get hearing aids. And then you can also get cochlear implants. They are quite expensive. And this is often done in people that are actually born deaf, although they also encourage people to learn sign language if they are deaf, but cochlear implants is another treatment for deafness. Okay, let us now rather do a question in your notes again instead of mind the gap. So we are going to do, let me have a look. We can do question, okay, you can turn to page 27. Quickly turn to page 27. Okay, on page 27, question 3. Now let me go there as well. There we go. So we're going to go to page 27. Okay, we've already done a question on the eye. So let us do this question 3 on the ear, right? Now, again, it's got some easier questions and some more difficult questions. Okay, so you need to identify certain parts. Okay, those are all short questions. Describe the role of the semicircular canals in maintaining balance. All right, so we're not talking about hearing now. Now we're talking about balance. You can do that. Now describe, and it's 5 marks. You're going to be describing a process, right? So you need to have quite a few facts there. Then describe how an increased production of mucus in the nose and throat may lead to the bursting of part E. Explain why fusion of the structures at A, so that's those little ossicles, may cause hearing loss. Explain the effect of the receptors in region C are damaged over here in the cochlea. And then describe how the parts of the middle ear, including the membranes, assist with amplifying sounds. Okay, I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do that question on the ear, and then we'll leave the one on the eye on the next page because we've already done a question on that. So if you can quickly do this question on the ear, and it's on page 27 in your notes. Okay, great. Oh, Matrix, I haven't given you a lot of time to do this, but let's see how you went. I think I'm going to quickly show you the answers because then it will be easier for you to see where you went wrong. So the first question was, let me just see, identify parts B and D. So B is the auditory nerve and D is the round window. So that's even the one that I get confused with. So the oval window is the one that the stirrup is attached to, and then D is the round window. Then it says which part of the brain will receive impulses from part C. Now, part C, remember, is involved in hearing because that's the cochlea. So the answer there is cerebrum. Then it says, describe the role of the semicircular canals in maintaining balance. All right. So there we go. The cristae, okay, these are these little receptors that respond to mechanical stimuli, because remember there's fluid inside those semicircular canals. So the cristae in the semicircular canals are stimulated by changes in speed and direction when the endolymph moves. The endolymph is the name of the fluid. The cristae convert the stimuli to nerve impulses. The nerve impulses are transported along the auditory nerve to the cerebellum to be interpreted, and impulses are also sent to the muscles to restore balance. Okay, so you need to know about, okay, that's all fine. Then the next one says, describe how an increased production of mucus in the nose and throat may lead to the bursting of part E. And part E, remember, is the eardrum or tympanic membrane. So here we've got two possible solutions. So you can either say the mucus will block the opening of the eustachian tube. Remember, that's that little tube that goes from the middle ear into the back of the throat. So air cannot enter or leave the middle ear to equalize pressure, causing an imbalance in the pressure. Or you can say the mucus may move through the eustachian tube, causing pressure in the middle ear, and this pushes against the tympanic membrane. Then 3.5, explain why fusion of the structures at A may lead to hearing loss. So those were the three little bony ossicles. So obviously they will not be able to vibrate, and no vibrations will be passed to the inner ear or to the cochlea, and this will not be stimulated, and there's no amplification of these sound waves. Then 3.6 was, explain the effect if the receptors in region C are damaged. Now, region C is where your receptors are situated that are involved in hearing. So obviously, then it's going to impact on your hearing. Right, so the receptors can't change the stimuli into impulses, so there are fewer or no impulses transmitted to the cerebrum, and the person does not hear anything or their hearing is impaired. And then the last question, describe how the parts of the middle ear, including the membranes, assist with amplifying sounds. So in other words, making them bigger, all right? So the sound vibrations are first transmitted from the large tympanic membrane. Now this is your first membrane, to the smaller oval window, that's your next membrane, through the ossicles, which are arranged from largest to smallest. This concentrates the vibrations, amplifying them. Now, Matrix, these last few questions have been in bold type for a reason. They are more difficult questions. But with a question like this, there always are some questions that you will be able to answer, all right? And just attempt, really try hard, answering the other questions as well. Remember, they are more where you have to now apply your knowledge. So if you understand your work very, very well, then you won't have a problem in applying your knowledge and doing these questions. Right. Now we're going to go back in our notes again, because now we are going to go onto the endocrine system. So now we need to go back again. So there we've done the eye and the ear already over there. And now we go onto the human endocrine system. Now, to be honest, there isn't all that much that I need to do with you and the reason is because a lot of these names of the hormones we either did in grade 11 or we discussed them when we did reproduction earlier on. So a lot of these hormones you actually are familiar with already. So when we talk about the human endocrine system, we're talking about the hormonal system, right? That's what we're talking about. And you need to know about the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So endocrine glands don't have ducts and they always secrete hormones, right? They always secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream and they don't have little ducts. And then there's just a mistake over here. This should be exo over here. So exocrine glands, they release their secretions through ducts. So there are ducts present into a body cavity or to the outside. So salivary glands that secrete saliva into your mouth, those are exocrine glands. Or sweat glands that secrete sweat, those would be exocrine glands. And even your pancreas that secretes pancreatic juice into the small intestine, that is an exocrine gland, okay? But the ones that secrete hormones, we call those endocrine glands. Then here it just tells you what hormones are. So they are organic. Most of them are proteins, but there are some that are steroids, that are fats, but most are proteins. They're produced in very, very small quantities over here, and they go directly into the bloodstream. And then they go to all the different parts of the body, but they only actually have an effect on the target organ, right? So if you think of something like when we did follicle stimulating hormone, when we did reproduction earlier on, the name already, it really tells you what it does. So obviously, although it travels all over the body, its target organ is the ovary, and especially those little primary follicles, which it brings about maturation of them to form a Graafian follicle. And then hormones have a regulatory function. They can either stimulate or inhibit. Okay, and then over here are all the different endocrine glands and their functions. So you need to know where they are and what hormones they secrete and the functions of the hormones. But now, as I said, you will see that there are maybe one or two hormones here that you haven't heard of before, but all the others are familiar to you. So for example, over here, I'm going to quickly go to my, actually it's fine, but over here we've got antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Now ADH we spoke about when we did the chapter on excretion in grade 11, right? So this hormone, and by the way, we're going to talk about it again later on because we do homeostasis just now, and you need to know the homeostatic mechanism which keeps water content in the body constant. So ADH, it is produced by the hypothalamus, that little gland over there, and it produces a hormone which regulates the water concentration in the blood. So this one we've spoken about. Now here is a new hormone. We haven't spoken about thyroxine before. So there is the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland is sort of situated in the region of the larynx, and it produces the hormone thyroxine, and thyroxine controls your metabolic rate. So your metabolic rate really is how much energy is released during the process of respiration. And some people have a higher metabolic rate than others. So thyroxine controls your metabolic rate. And this is a new hormone. Then adrenaline, you might have heard about, but adrenaline is secreted by the adrenal gland, and the adrenal gland is this little gland that is found just above the kidney, and it works together with your sympathetic nervous system. So if you look at some of the functions of adrenaline, you will see that it overlaps with those functions of the sympathetic nervous system. So in other words, all the things that happen to prepare the body for an emergency, or all the things that happen when you get a huge fright. So your heartbeat increases, your blood pressure increases. Obviously, your glycogen has to be converted to glucose. This happens in the liver because glucose is a very important store of energy, and we need a lot of energy from the process of cellular respiration so that your muscles, so that you can run away or fight or whatever it is, but you need a lot of energy which comes from glucose. So as I said, I'm not going to go through all of these, but it brings about, it has a similar effect to the sympathetic nervous system. Then, yeah, we've got estrogen and progesterone again. There's nothing new here again because we've already discussed these two hormones when we did reproduction. The testes produce testosterone, nothing new here. We did this when we did reproduction. There we've got two hormones, glucagon and insulin. This is also not new to you because when we did the chapter on nutrition in grade 11, we ended off by talking about the homeostatic control of glucose, which, by the way, you need to study again in matric. So those hormones you've heard about, here we go, FSH and LH we've spoken about already. The only new one is prolactin, all right? And prolactin, the lactin and lactose which you find in milk, that should already help you. So it stimulates the mammary glands to secrete milk. Then here are two hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland that you may not have heard about. So the pituitary gland is this little gland. It's only about the size of a pea, but it produces growth hormone, and that's not too difficult to remember either, because growth hormone, it brings about growth of your muscles and skeleton and so on. And then it produces a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, and that, if you read that carefully, it also tells you what it does. So it stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete thyroxine. Okay, so those hormones, you need to know where the glands are found, which hormones are produced, and what their functions are. Okay, now we go on to homeostasis. Now, homeostasis can be a little bit confusing. I've got a very nice video which I hope that I can show you at the end on homeostasis, so I will do that later. But homeostasis, there's the definition. It is the process of maintaining a constant internal environment in the body. Okay, so in your body, for example, your temperature needs to stay constant. So your temperature needs to stay at about 37 degrees Celsius, because if the temperature rises too much, it can affect the functioning of the enzymes, and that in turn can affect, that obviously will have an impact on the functioning of various organs and systems in your body. And so there are a number of factors that have to stay constant. So for example, your glucose levels need to stay the same, because if your glucose levels drop too much, then obviously cellular respiration can't occur, and your body cells aren't going to get enough energy. Then the amount of water has to stay constant in the body. The amount of salts need to stay constant inside the blood, the pH, and so on. So you need to know about, and this is all controlled by what we call negative feedback mechanisms. So these negative feedback mechanisms operate in the body to detect changes in the internal environment and to restore the balance again. Okay, now the only new negative feedback mechanism that you need to study, and you need to study by the way, there are about 5 of them in total, but the only new one is this one between thyroid stimulating hormone and thyroxine, okay? So let's just go, this little diagram illustrates it quite nicely. Now remember, thyroxine is a hormone that is produced by the thyroid gland, and thyroid stimulating hormone, the name already tells you, is a hormone produced by the hypophysis. Now, the level of these two hormones has to stay the same, especially the thyroxine, because thyroxine controls your metabolic rate. And your metabolic rate, remember, that is how much energy basically you are going to be using. Now let's have a look what happens. So let's say that the amount of thyroxine in the blood is going to drop. Okay, so we're doing this top arrow over here. So if that happens, that becomes a problem, because then your metabolic rate is going to drop, which you don't want, because you're going to be lethargic, lacking in energy, you won't be able to concentrate, and so on. So if the thyroxine levels drop, then that is going to be picked up by the hypophysis, and it then is going to produce more thyroid stimulating hormone. So that already tells you what's going to happen. That's going to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more thyroxine till it goes back to normal again. Then just the opposite. If the thyroxine levels go up too much, so there's too much thyroxine in the blood, so then your metabolic rate might be very, very high. By the way, thyroxine does have other effects besides the metabolic rate, but I'm going to focus on that. So let's say that thyroxine levels are too high. That is going to be picked up by the hypophysis again, and it is then going to be stimulated to produce less thyroid stimulating hormone, and the thyroid gland is going to produce less thyroxine so that it goes back to normal again. Okay, so this is called a negative feedback mechanism. So the one hormone is actually controlling the levels of the other hormone and vice versa, and making sure that the levels stay the same in the blood. All right. Then we need to know about some thyroid disorders. So an oversecretion of thyroxine. If you produce too much thyroxine, it's going to cause an increased metabolic rate and weight loss. All right. And then undersecretion of thyroxine will cause a low metabolic rate. Okay. So as I said, you're going to be tired, lacking in energy. Then it causes cretinism in children, and it causes mixed edema in adults. Let me just quickly show you a picture here. Okay, there we go. So in children, an undersecretion of thyroxine causes something called cretinism, and it obviously affects the mental abilities of the children as well. And an undersecretion in adults causes mixed edema. And you can see here are some of the symptoms. So the hair is dry and coarse and sparse, eyebrows become thin, and then you get this sort of fluid that collects over here in the eyeball, well, in the eye over here. That's called edema. The face becomes puffy and dull and so on. And remember, an undersecretion of thyroxine, there could be various reasons, but it could also be due to a lack of iodine in the diet. And iodine you get from eating seafood, or you can also obviously buy iodized salt, which also has iodine in it. So you need the element iodine to produce thyroxine, all right? So that's why it is important to see that you get enough iodine in your diet. Right, let's go back to our PowerPoint again. Okay, so as I said, you do need to know all the other negative feedback mechanisms as well. Now, and we did all of these in grade 11, and to be honest, I can almost guarantee that you're going to be asked one of these in the exams. In fact, in one exam paper, I couldn't believe it, but I think that there were about 3 of these negative feedback mechanisms that were asked. Okay, so this one is the one that controls the glucose levels in the blood. And the two hormones that are involved are insulin and glucagon. Now, please be very, very careful. Here you can see the word glucagon. Now, glucagon is the name of a hormone, right? And both of these hormones, by the way, are produced by the pancreas, okay? And they both are involved in controlling the glucose levels in the blood. Now have a look at that word glucagon, and then have a look at this word glycogen. Now those two words are so similar, but they mean different things. So I want you to be very, very careful that you do not make a mistake. So glycogen is not a hormone. This is a carbohydrate, and it is the form in which glucose is stored in the liver and muscles. So glucose is a small molecule and glycogen is a big molecule, and it's made up of lots and lots of glucose molecules, right? So it is the form in which you store glucose in the liver and muscles. All right. So do not be confused with this. Now let's do one of these. So let's say you've had a lovely little treat and you've now had a pizza and you've had a Coke and ice cream afterwards. So obviously your glucose levels have increased tremendously. But now I told you your glucose levels actually have to stay the same all the time. So what happens is that in the pancreas, you've got these islets of Langerhans, and they are stimulated, and they produce the hormone insulin over here. What does insulin do? It goes to the liver, and it stimulates all this excess, so all this extra glucose which you've got circulating in the blood. All that extra glucose is converted into glycogen, and it's stored in the liver and muscles, and the glucose levels go down again. All right. And then just the opposite happens. Let's say you had your supper at 7 o'clock in the evening, and now it's you've had a Saturday morning and you've slept a little bit later, and it's now 9 o'clock and you haven't had breakfast. Obviously, your glucose levels will have dropped. And again, this is picked up by the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, but now they produce a different hormone called glucagon. And glucagon again goes to the liver, and now all that glycogen is now beginning to be changed to glucose, and the glucose goes into the blood and it brings it back to normal again. Right. Then you should also know about the disease diabetes, which is when you can read up about this as well, but this is when the pancreas is not functioning optimally and you've got high glucose levels in the blood, and you need to often have injections of insulin. Right. Then this one we also did in grade 11, but now I don't know how well you remember this. This is now the control of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. Okay, now it's very important that the amount of carbon dioxide should stay the same, because if carbon dioxide builds up, it affects the pH of the blood. And those of you that do a bit of chemistry and physics will know that carbon dioxide will combine with water to form an acid called carbonic acid. And an acid obviously lowers the pH. And that carbonic acid can actually break up to form hydrogen ions as well. And we know that when you've got a lot of hydrogen ions in the blood, then your pH decreases, it becomes acidic. And we don't want that to happen, because we all know that enzymes can also be sensitive to the pH of the blood. And we do not, some of course do like to work in a very acidic pH, but others not. So we want the pH to stay constant. So let's see what happens when the carbon dioxide increases. So let's say you've been doing some vigorous exercise and the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood has increased. Now again, your receptors pick this up, and these are found in the aorta. That's a big blood vessel which leaves the heart. And your carotid arteries, these are blood vessels which go up to the brain. They are stimulated, and they are sensitive to chemicals, because hydrogen ions and so on are chemicals. They send impulses to the respiratory, and respiratory has to do with breathing, doesn't it? And cardiovascular has to do with the heart. So it sends these impulses to those centers, which are found in the medulla oblongata. Remember, that's the top part of the spinal cord where it goes a bit wider. So they are sent to the medulla oblongata of the brain. And it now sends impulses to the diaphragm and intercostal muscles. Remember, these are your muscles that are involved in breathing, right? So now the rate and depth of breathing increases. And as that happens, more carbon dioxide is exhaled. Also, the cardiovascular center sends impulse to the heart, and your heart rate increases, your heart beats more quickly, and so therefore more carbon dioxide or blood with carbon dioxide is transported to the lungs to be exhaled. All right, so this is the homeostatic mechanism of carbon dioxide. Then you also need to do the one for water. Now, for the one for water and salts, I just want to remind you about this little picture, which you may have forgotten. Okay. Do you remember in grade 11 when you did the kidney? Right, you've got your two kidneys. Now, in each kidney, you've got these microscopic structures called nephrons, and there are about 1 million nephrons in each kidney. All right, and I don't know if you remember this picture over here. So your blood with all the wastes goes in over here, and then those wastes go into this structure over here, but then a lot of the good substances also go in there, and they go back into the surrounding blood capillaries, and then the waste eventually will go to the bladder to be excreted. But now, this part of the nephron is called the distal convoluted tubule, and this part of the nephron is called the collecting duct. And these two parts of the renal tubule play a very important role in what we call osmoregulation. And osmoregulation is the regulation of the water and the salt content of the blood. So when we talk about the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, that is what we're talking about. It's that part of the nephron. Right. So let's quickly look at that again. Okay, so firstly, water. I don't think I'm going to do both of these. But let's say that, for example, you've now, okay, it says, let's say that you've drunk huge amounts of water and it's winter, so you haven't sweated much, and now you, obviously, that water that you've drunk needs to be excreted, right? So the hypothalamus will be stimulated, and impulses are sent to the hypophysis. You can also call that the pituitary gland. And now less of the hormone ADH is going to be produced. All right? So there is going to be less ADH is transported to the kidneys. And then I showed you those collecting ducts and distal convoluted tubules. They become less permeable to water. So what that means, I just want to show you this once again. What that means is that water, instead of going to, if they are less permeable to water, that means the water is not going to go back into the blood capillaries anymore, but it's going to stay inside this tubule, right? That's what that means. So they become less permeable to water. So less water is reabsorbed and passed to the surrounding blood vessels, and more water is excreted in the urine. Okay, and then obviously the opposite happens. Let's say it's a boiling hot day and you forgot to bring your juice and your water to school, and you've been doing sport all afternoon and you've lost a lot of sweat as well. Then the opposite has to happen, because obviously then your kidneys need to conserve water, and that water mustn't be excreted in the urine. Okay. Then you also need to do the negative feedback mechanism, which controls the concentration of salts. All right. So sometimes people have food poisoning, or they're ill and they get diarrhea and so on, and they lose a lot of salts. that becomes very, very dangerous. So your body has to somehow do by means of a negative feedback mechanism, it needs to reabsorb or keep as much salt in the body as possible. So let's say that the salt level decreases for some or other reason. Again, this is picked up by receptor cells in the kidneys. All right, they're sensitive. They detect the low salt or sodium ion concentration. And now the adrenal gland, that little gland just above the kidneys, secretes more aldosterone, and the reabsorption of sodium ions from the renal tubules increases. So more salt is going to be reabsorbed and less will be excreted in the urine. Okay, so you do need to do all of those. Then another new one is temperature regulation. But this is such a nice, easy one, actually, that I don't think you will have any problem with this. All right, so this little drawing that we've got over here, that over here is a sweat gland, and those are little droplets of sweat. So what we've got here is a section, a little bit of the skin, and these are blood vessels in the skin. Now, when you study this section, you do need to study the structure of the skin, but mainly the parts of the skin that are involved in thermoregulation. So don't worry too much about all the other labels. Just focus on the blood vessels and the sweat glands and so on, the ones that are involved in thermoregulation. Thermoregulation obviously means temperature regulation. But this is a very nice, easy homeostatic mechanism. So let's say, again, it's now getting summer, like earlier this week, I think it was Wednesday, was a boiling hot day, right? So on a hot day like that, what happens is that you've got thermoreceptors in the skin that are going to be stimulated by the heat, and messages are going to be sent to the hypothalamus, which is again part of the brain. And it sends messages to the sweat glands, and the sweat glands are now going to produce more sweat. Now, when these little droplets of sweat, that liquid, when that lies on the skin, it's going to evaporate, right? And that is a physical reaction because water changes to a liquid. And the liquid changes to a gas. And in that process, it changes from water to water vapor. And in that process, it's going to cool your skin, all right? So you're going to cool down. And another thing that happens is that your blood vessels dilate. Dilate means they become wider. That's why we often look flushed and hot and so on. So the blood vessels dilate and they run closer to the surface of the skin. And now we are obviously warm-blooded. We say we are endothermic. So this heat is now going to be lost through the skin by various processes, by radiation, for example, and so on. So we lose heat to the environment, and that cools our body down. And then obviously on a cold day, like even today, I see it's starting to get darker and cooler outside. On a cold day, then again, your thermoreceptors in the skin are going to be stimulated. They send a message to the hypothalamus, and you're going to produce less sweat, and your blood vessels are going to constrict. We call that vasoconstriction. They become narrower. So that means that less heat is going to be lost by radiation, convection, etc. I think that's a nice, easy homeostatic mechanism. So I would definitely spend time learning that. Let me just see if there's a question. I've actually misplaced my piece of paper. Oh, here it is with all the questions on it. Right, there are, I'm looking at the time, it's 20 past now. And okay, I think what I want to do is, because obviously your teachers are also able to, I don't know if these answers are online, but you know, there are many essays with answers that you can look at. So instead of doing that, I want to quickly go on to the well, you can't call it the endocrine system, but a hormonal system in plants, all right? It's actually called responding to the environment. That is better, that's worded a little better, because sometimes when you say plants have hormones, then unless people have studied life sciences, they don't believe that plants have hormones. So we're going to quickly talk about these hormones that you find in plants. So we literally are jumping now from the homeostatic mechanisms, which you need to study. So the one for water, salts, carbon dioxide, glucose, temperature, and you do need to know that negative feedback mechanism with the thyroxine as well. So just very quickly, there's just one thing that I really want to focus on, because I do think that you could be asked this. So when we talk about the hormones in plants, the first thing is fairly straightforward. You need to learn the functions of these three hormones, all right? Auxins, gibberellins, and abscisic acid, right? That's quite straightforward, but just remember that these two hormones, the first two, often stimulate growth, and abscisic acid, it actually sort of inhibits growth, all right? It's sort of, yeah, so for example, you can see, for example, when in winter, you don't want your seeds to germinate, so then it's responsible for the dormancy of seeds, all right? And the dormancy, like in winter when you've got your deciduous trees that lose all their leaves in winter. Now, you don't want those little buds to start shooting in the middle of winter. They must only start shooting in spring. So it brings about the dormancy of these buds. So you can just remember that. But what I want to talk about, I'm not going to focus on that, but I do want to talk about phototropism and geotropism, because these are asked in the exams, so often. Let me just remind you what those are. All right. So phototropism is when a part of the plant grows towards light, all right? And obviously it's normally the leaf towards light or the tip of the stem that grows towards light. And that is obviously for a reason, because the leaves of plants need light for the process of photosynthesis. So this would be positive phototropism. And if a part of the plant grows away from light, that would be negative phototropism. But then we also talk about a phenomenon called geotropism. And geotropism is a growth movement of a part of a plant in response to gravity. But now if it grows towards or away from gravity, they've got different names. So, sorry, let's just go back to that. So obviously the roots of a plant, they are always positively geotropic. They're going to grow downwards towards gravity. And again, there's a reason for that, because the roots need to absorb water and mineral salts. Okay, so they need to grow down towards the soil. And then the stem and leaves of a plant are negatively geotropic. They always grow away from light. So you need to know those two definitions. Then you need to know especially the effect of auxin on these growth movements. All right, now I want to do this very quickly because these are often asked in the exams. So auxin, this is a tip of a stem, right? And auxin is produced at the tip of the stem, and it will move down vertically, all right? And auxin, one of the things it does, these are all little cells, and one of the things it does is it brings about cell elongation, right? Makes the cells longer. But now I want you to have a look what happens here. If light reaches the plant from one direction, the auxins are very sensitive to light, and they will move away from light to the shaded part of the stem. So they move to this side. Now what happens is that these cells are going to elongate more rapidly because there's more auxin there than these sides which are on the shaded side, and that means that the tip of the stem will always grow towards light. So just let me repeat that. So under the influence of light, Auxin, because it's sensitive to light, will move away from light. But because auxin brings about cell elongation, these cells are going to elongate more rapidly than the ones on the shaded side, and therefore the stem grows towards light. Okay, this picture also illustrates that. Yeah, if you put a plant in a box and there's light coming from one direction, after a while, that plant is going to grow towards light. But the thing that I really do want to focus on is that I've said to you now that auxins in a stem will stimulate cell elongation. Now, what I want you to write down in big, bold letters and to remember is that high concentrations of auxins in a root will actually inhibit cell elongation. Now, you've got this picture in your notes as well, and this illustrates it very well. So over here, we've got a plant that's been laid on its side. These are the roots, and those are the leaves. These little dots are the auxins that have moved to the lower side, and they've moved to the lower side under the influence of gravity. But now have a look how the auxin has a different effect in the stem as in the root. So as I said, in the stem, the auxin, high levels of auxin, by the way, I'm talking about, this is illustrating geotropism, right? So in the stem, the high concentrations of auxin are going to stimulate cell elongation over here. So these cells elongate more rapidly than those, and the tip of the stem is going to grow away from gravity. So it's negatively geotropic. And then in the root, the high concentrations inhibit cell elongation. So now the ones at the top over here are actually elongating more quickly, and that is why the root bends downwards and grows towards gravity, and that is called positive geotropism. So the big thing to remember over here is that in a stem, high concentrations of auxin will stimulate cell elongation, but in a stem, high concentrations of auxin will inhibit cell elongation. Now, I just want to go back to your notes quickly. All right, so this phototropism and geotropism do spend time on, because I am sure there will be a question on that. Now you will see that the last section is human impact on the environment. Now, this section was done with you in grade 11, and this section will be retested in grade 12, and it's subdivided into different sections. There are about 6 different sections. So you've got the atmosphere and climate change, water availability, water quality, food security, loss of biodiversity, and solid waste disposal. Now, with this section, it's the learning that you're going to do is going to be slightly different, because yes, there are definitions that you need to know. As I'm looking over here, there's a difference between, for example, a greenhouse effect and the enhanced. All right, these mean different things. And there's desertification. You need to know the definition for that, and deforestation. So yes, there are definitions that you need to know, but the best preparation that you're going to do, and I would definitely read through everything and make sure that you understand it well, but you will be very well prepared if you go through old exam papers on and do the questions on human impact, all right? Because this really does require more understanding of the concept. And by the way, this is a hugely important concept, this human impact on the environment. Those of you that have been reading the news, you will have seen all those wildfires that we had in America last year, and in Australia especially. And now there's a huge wildfire that is destroying wetlands, and wetlands are carbon sinks, and they are releasing all these masses of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So also, what is great news, you would have also seen that under the previous administration with Donald Trump, he withdrew from the climate accord, but now with Joe Biden. He's going to join this, which is fantastic news because America, being a huge country, is also hugely responsible for climate change and global warming. So I want you to learn the definitions very, very well, and then to go through it, make sure you understand it, and then to try and work through as many examples as you can on human impact. And now, Matrix, I hope I have been able to help you. I see it is now 1:30, and I think the notes that you've been given are extremely useful. And I think Mind the Gap is also extremely useful. And I know that you write later on this month, and I really, really wish you very well with your exams that it goes. And just use your time wisely. Don't spend time on your cell phones or anything like that. Just use your time to studying. It's going to be worth it in the end. And I do hope that these online lessons have helped you. And I don't know if Mr. Farmer wants to say anything, but I've basically finished now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clark. I really want to thank you for the time and your, all the time that you've sacrificed for us over the last month or so, 2 months. I was switching between your session and the Afrikaans session, but the Afrikaans session unfortunately had some technical problems. But as I was listening to you, I was really thinking back, about the importance of the topics that you stressed to learners, and I hope they've listened and took some note of it. And so that is really why I'm thankful and grateful for your time as the clerk. I'm sure the learners are as well. I like the way you bring the work across to them and the way you stress certain topics. I really enjoy your lessons. And I want to echo your words, Mr. Clerk. I said it to the grade 12 in the Afrikaans session as well now. You see, this is now the time for sacrifice. The time to be serious, grade 12s. I expect every grade 12 learner to work every weekend. So this weekend should be a working weekend. With some breaks in, obviously, but, the socializing can wait till after the exams. This is a short period of sacrifice that we expect of you, and that I'm sure you will reap the benefits of afterwards. So with that, I just want to wish all of you very, very well with the exams and your preparation. And like Mr. Clerk said, working through past papers is really the best way to prepare for the exam. You get a sense of how the examiners pose the questions, and if you can, also look at the answers, the memos of these question papers, and you'll see how they allocate marks. And so just like with a marathon, you can't run a marathon or run a race without being fit or prepared. So I'd like you guys to really prepare for your marathon or your exam at the end of the year. All right, all of the best, and thank you once again, Mr. Clerk.
It's a pleasure, Mr. Farmer. It's a pleasure.
Lovely. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we'll switch off the chat. So thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, good
Thanks.
night. Goodbye.